Support for this episode comes from the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. Feeling overwhelmed by the climate crisis? The Institute for Jewish Spirituality invites you to Mindfulness for the Climate Crisis, Resilience in a Changing World. This online course offers Jewish mindfulness practices to help you navigate uncertainty with wisdom and compassion. Learn meditation, contemplative study, and practical tools to stay present and engaged. Enroll by March 12th at jewishspirituality.org and get $50 off with the code JU50. That's JU50.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 472, Israel-Palestine, What You're Against and What You're For. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Ruttenberg.
And today we're back with the latest episode in our ongoing exploration of American Jewish discourse about Israel-Palestine. We're featuring two guests today, one a returning friend of the show and the other making her first appearance. Our returning guest is Danya Ruttenberg, who among many other things has become one of the leading voices channeling Jewish tradition in digital spaces. And the guest making her Judaism Unbound debut is Ilana Sumka, who recently founded an organization called Shleimut, Jewish Paths to Wholeness and Peace. Danya Ruttenberg and Ilana Sumka don't work together directly in a particular organization, but they do collaborate regularly on efforts to promote mutual understanding, justice, and a brighter world for Israelis and Palestinians, and I think you'll understand from our conversation why we had them on together. Before we dive in, just a quick reminder that registration is now open for our next round of courses in the Unyeshiva, our digital center for Jewish learning and unlearning. You can learn more about these classes at judaismunbound.com/classes, and financial aid is available for any and all of them because we don't want ability to pay to be a barrier to learning Torah with us. In particular, we want to give a shout out this week to Judaism Inbound, a 12-week course that many take as a first step toward conversion, but that others can take as an intro to Judaism. Judaism Inbound begins next week, so if you've been looking for this kind of class, you're going to want to go over to judaismunbound.com/classes right now and sign up. And if you want to find out about any of the other amazing 8-week courses we have going on this spring, just head over to the same website, judaismunbound.com/classes. So now a little bit more introduction of our guests today, Danya Ruttenberg and Ilana Sumka. Danya Ruttenberg is an award-winning author who's active in many movements for justice. She's been named by Newsweek as a rabbi to watch and as a faith leader to watch by the Center for American Progress. She has also received the Lives of Commitment Award from Auburn Seminary and the Rabbinic Human Rights Hero Award from Truah. Danya Ruttenberg has served as a leading rabbinic voice on Judaism and reproductive freedom, organizing a network of 2,500 rabbis for repro. In other roles, she's organized the Jewish community to fight for economic justice, created frameworks for dialogue and understanding across lines of difference, and led student communities on several college campuses. Danya Ruttenberg has written 8 books, including, most recently, on repentance and repair, making amends in an unapologetic world, which we discussed here on Judaism Unbound, and which also, by the way, has received a National Jewish Book Award, and was selected as an American Library Association Sophie Brody Honor Book. Danya Ruttenberg has also written for The New York Times, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, Salon, and Time, been featured on NPR, The Today Show, CNN, Vice, and MTV News, and she has even been a Sunday Washington Post crossword clue, 83 down. To follow Danya Ruttenberg's latest work and writing, check out lifeisasacredtext.com, her website, which includes a Substack with over 25,000 subscribers. You can hear more of her wisdom by listening to her 2 previous appearances on Judaism Unbound in episodes 243 and 397. Our second guest, Ilana Sumka, is the founding director of Shleimut, Jewish Paths to Wholeness and Peace. She has more than 2 decades of experience as a nonprofit leader, facilitator, experiential educator, and community organizer. Ilana Sumka served as the Jerusalem director of Encounter from 2006 to 2011, and then went on to found the Center for Jewish Nonviolence, which she led until 2018. In 2011, she was recognized for her dedication to ending the Israeli occupation and became the first Jewish person to receive an honorary Bethlehem passport as part of the international Open Bethlehem campaign. Ilana Sumka was previously one of the initial organizers with New York's Progressive Working Families Party in 1997 after a training with Acorn in Chicago. She has worked in international human rights with American Jewish World Service and served as an election monitor in Bosnia and Albania with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Ilana Sumka currently lives in Belgium, where she is a rabbi in training with Aleph, the Alliance for Jewish Renewal. Danya Ruttenberg, welcome back to Judaism Unbound. Ilana Sumka, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you both.
It's great to be here.
So great to be here.
So I wanted to start by, Ilana, I understand, if I understand your work correctly, it's kind of imagining that there might be a better way to do these things than we tend to be doing them. And so I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about that better way that there ought to be, and then maybe a little bit about how you're trying to get us there.
I love that framing. The organization that I'm currently the director of is called Shlemut. And Shlemut is Hebrew for wholeness, and it shares the same root as shalom, peace. As a very basic concept, I know most of the Jewish world would love to see an Israel-Palestine that's living in peace. The question, of course, is how do we get there? It's very easy to talk about peace and much harder to actualize it. One of the reasons that I started Shlemut to really emphasize wholeness is that in the 20 years that I've been doing Israel-Palestine work, I've come to appreciate how many parts of myself as an American Jew were broken as someone who grew up scared that I'd have to hide in Anne Frank's attic in my own house, and thinking that if the Nazis ever did come to America, the Israeli soldiers would come and rescue me. It was a huge shock to my system when the first time I was in the occupied West Bank during the 7 years that I lived in Jerusalem, I saw an Israeli soldier who was probably about 18 years old harassing a Palestinian grandmother. And I didn't understand how we'd gotten to that point. And I felt like something had gone very, very wrong and something was very, very broken. Part of what I've come to appreciate is that the more we as American Jews can become whole, the more we heal ourselves, and the more we find our own peace within ourselves, the more we can be agents and instruments of peace to advocate for peace in Israel-Palestine.
So what does that look like in the reality that we live in? I guess both in Israel and Palestine. I mean, I know that, I know that Danya's talked about experiences in the educational system in Jerusalem where there are these schools for both Jews and Palestinians. But that's just one example. I mean, what would have to happen practically for some of this to be better off? Because I've actually been struggling a lot with this question about what we might call sort of a messianic, a kind of an idealistic, wouldn't it be better if everybody lived in peace and harmony? And whether that's in a one state or in a two states or whatever that might be. And I'm like, no matter which of these positions somebody holds, what they tend to articulate seems to be a quixotic, idealized, if only the lion would lie down with the lamb. And I'm like, yeah, who isn't for the lion lying down with the lamb? It's just that if that happens anytime soon, one of them is going to be in trouble. And I guess it's always the lamb, and it depends which one you think is the lamb in the story. So the point is, like, what can be done in our time to make positive progress?
In the immediate term, and depending on when listeners are hearing this, there needs to be a stop to the violence. There needs to be a full, complete, permanent ceasefire. At the time that we're recording this, we are thankfully in a ceasefire, and I pray that it lasts, but we don't know what will be down the road from here. One of the first things that needs to happen in Israel-Palestine is a massive amount of education and humanizing of the other. There's no way to bring about any kind of peaceful shared society of any number of states without an extraordinary amount of understanding the sheer humanity of the other. And that's something that we can also model as American Jews and that we can also advocate for as American Jews. I think it's important to think about the immediate term, which is putting down the guns. There's a medium term, which is a humanizing and understanding of the other. And there's a long-term trajectory. And it is going to sound pie in the sky, which I'm well aware of. But I also think we need to have a North Star. We have to say, what are we striving for? You know, during years of American slavery, it would have sounded absolutely unrealistic to talk about the idea that I think is not radical that I'm going to suggest, which is one person, one vote. During the years when Blacks were kept as property, that idea would have sounded preposterous. And now it's an idea that we take as a given in American society. My North Star for Israel-Palestine is one person, one vote. And I think it's important to talk about it now because I think we have to understand what the long-term trajectory is. And I also think that even if, without a doubt, there is not going to be a one person, one vote reality for all of the people who live in the borders controlled by the Israeli government, when we raise that question, what it does is it pinpoints the anxieties and uncertainties that people have about equality. If we believe in equality, and the American Jewish community that I was raised in absolutely supports and stands by equality, what are we scared of in the long run in implementing genuine equality? It's actually a foundational premise in the Torah. The Torah lists no fewer than 4 times, there shall be one law for the citizen and for the stranger who dwells among you. That's a core tenet of our teaching. I would want to ask, what's wrong with that? What objections do people have to extending absolute, genuine equity as a North Star for Israelis and Palestinians?
We definitely need to be thinking in stages, the immediate, the middle term, and the long term. One piece of the puzzle that is so often left behind, people are not talking about gender. And I want to bring out some statistics. According to Liz Hume, the executive director of the Alliance for Peace Building, when women are part of the peace process, and this is, global statistics, many different situations processed over decades, those peace outcomes are 35% more likely to last beyond 15 years. And there's another study that indicates that including women in peace-building efforts increases the probability of ending violence by 24%. Is that because women are inherently more peace-inclined? No, of course not. It is largely because historically, women have been holding a space in society wherein they are responsible for different pieces of the puzzle. And so they're responsible for thinking about what is best for the children, thinking towards what's going on for next generations, thinking about education, thinking about food resources, and so on. Power flows differently. And one of the big ironies of this whole thing is that there was a gigantic campaign between Women Wage Peace, which is the organization of Palestinian citizens of Israel and Israeli Jews, and Women of the Sun, which is Palestinian women in the West Bank and Gaza. They had created a covenant together to create a process, no matter what, and to fight for a political solution, no matter what. And they began a campaign, and their kickoff event was on October 4th.
Of 2023, I
2023, yeah. And there are photos of them walking around Jerusalem with these Women Wage Peace, Women of the Sun signs and doing these solidarity events at a bunch of different places to try to push the government, the Israeli government, to come back to the table to re-engage towards a political solution. October 4th.
So part of what I want to get to in this conversation is the ways in which, Ilana, you have been, before we started the show, we were talking about this work a little bit, and you use the phrase like in the vortex, or Dan used the phrase in the vortex. Like you get in this mini microcosmic universe that's, quote unquote, Israel-Palestine peace work or nonviolence work or dialogue work, or however we want to distill some of this. Then there's most people who their jobs, their day-to-day lives are not primarily focused on that work. And what a lot of us in that universe are sitting with is, how do we mobilize ourselves? How do we become part of, the solution or many solutions without it necessarily being the piece of our day-to-day work that we're able to, mobilize our professional time towards. And so I'm interested in that. But one piece I wanted to dwell on, Ilana, with your work is that shleimut, you mentioned, it means wholeness. I'm a language guy, and so I just get caught in little linguistic things. The previous organization that you helped found, or I don't know if you helped found or if you just founded it, it was Center for Jewish Nonviolence. It was a non. And a lot of the things that people love to say in these conversations, like, so you're saying what you oppose, what are you for, right? And that comes up with the prefixes people use for Zionism, anti-Zionism, etc. But nonviolence is one that gets less pushback. But then this new organization, Shleimut, is very much it's wholeness. And what's interesting is I think there's a subtle intervention in Hebrew that the word shalom makes to us. I growing up, peace, if you asked me what peace was, I'd be like, it's when people aren't fighting. That's, I think, how I would basically distill peace, that there is calm. But what wholeness suggests, what Shleimut suggests, is that peace is not just an absence of active conflict. It's something, it's a noun in and of itself. It's not a non. And so I guess I'm curious to hear from you, Ilana, on that front, because I want to be working not towards just an absence of conflict. That is a key prerequisite of what I dream of. But I do actually hope for a world more of Shleimut, of wholeness. And so I'm curious, was that conscious in the two organization titles you chose, or how do you sit with those questions of what we're working against and what we're working towards?
My work has pivoted back and forth over these 2 decades between taking more of an emphasis on educational work, which is what I did with Encounter, which is the organization that I directed in Jerusalem before founding Center for Jewish Nonviolence. And after 5 years of bringing hundreds of Jews into the West Bank to understand the impact of the occupation on Palestinians, I started to feel the real limits of education. And I think this speaks to I'm going to get to what you're asking, Lex, about being against something, being for something. After 5 years of playing primarily an educational role, I saw the circumstances for Palestinians deteriorate in the West Bank, while the circumstances for Israelis stayed more or less the same. And I founded the Center for Jewish Nonviolence because I wanted to take a more active political position against the occupation in explicit solidarity with Palestinians. And as I did that work, which I loved, I started to notice that the quality of listening was not as high among the activist circles that I would have liked to see. There was more dogmatism and more orthodoxy. And so I took a step back from Center for Jewish Nonviolence and thought about what it was from Encounter that I thought had worked so well, and what it was that worked from Center for Jewish Nonviolence that worked so well, and tried to combine them together in Shleimut. So there was an intentional rounding out of 2 components that felt like they had not been in balance with each other. And one of the ways that I think about that is through this question of, well, how do we actually make change? Judaism has some really good pointers on this. And this speaks to being more than just the absence of peace. 2 of the concepts that I want to lift up are the interplay between gevura and chesed. So gevura, meaning strength or power or boundaries, if interpreted somewhat liberally, and chesed, meaning loving kindness, or interpreted more liberally, radical acceptance. How do these 2 concepts of strategic change live together? Because we find in activist circles that the way we present a case of justice is we draw a line and we say this side of justice and no further. This is just and this isn't. And if you cross this line, then you're crossing into the line of injustice. If we look at the world of psychology and personal growth and transformation, we know that one of the best ways that people can change is through the practice of radical acceptance, accepting people exactly as they are, how they are in the moment. And so how do these 2 things live together? I think this goes beyond the question of Israel-Palestine, even though Israel-Palestine is the issue that I spend most of my time thinking about. How do we hold simultaneously a sense of boundaried, gevuridic strength, this side of justice, while also wanting to lovingly, radically accept everything that a person is and that a people are? Being able to go into ourselves and seeing that we all have these dynamics play out within us. We all have a side where we say it's gone too far with injustice. And I think we also all want to be radically accepted the way that we are. So when we take these individual concepts on a personal level, I think we can apply them to the Israel-Palestine context. And that was a very intentional choice of building Shlemut, wanting to look at how we change on a personal level, juxtaposing it to how we change on a collective level, and how we can create change. Danya spoke about Women Wage Peace, which is this beautiful, expansive network of Israeli and Palestinian women working for peace. And I have followed their work and admired their work from a distance. And I'm also aware that there's been criticism of their work, that they haven't taken enough explicit political positions, that they haven't acknowledged the very real power imbalance between Israelis who have a nation state and an army and Palestinians who are stateless and subject to military occupation. So as change makers, and for people who want to get involved in change work in Israel-Palestine, I think we have options in thinking about how we engage with the change makers that exist out there. We can criticize the organizations that are working incredibly hard to bring peace to the work, or we can say there are all of these different paths to bringing peace. That's the choice that I've made. I think it's incredibly important for individuals who want to get involved in Israel-Palestine peace to both simultaneously look inside themselves and ask, how am I called in this moment to engage with this topic? What speaks to me? What capacity do I have? And of the organizations that are out there doing peace, what feels like it most aligns with my way of being in the world? There are so many ways that people can be involved in bringing about peace. And one of the contradictions that I think is part of wholeness is that we actually need multiple strategies because we don't know which is the one that's going to bring peace. And in all likelihood, it's going to be a combination of these strategies that are most likely to bring peace.
Civil rights wasn't just Martin Luther King, right? Civil rights was freedom riders. Civil rights wouldn't have happened without Malcolm X. Civil rights was Black Panthers, right? So every single movement for justice and liberation needs a lot of different arms and a lot of different voices. There's no there if we don't get all hands on deck.
I'm thinking about, Ilana, what you were saying earlier about what are people scared of? I think that would be a really beneficial place for us to dwell and marinate a little bit, because we're dealing with a lot of people that are afraid, and we're also dealing with a lot of people that are trying to help somebody they love who they are afraid for. And so, I think that a lot of the people who are supporting Israel imagine that their beloved people, the people that they feel connected to, are under this threat of violence, and they have chosen to go a certain way. And they're saying the best way I can be supportive to my friends and family is to try to support them. And they tell me they're afraid, that they tell me that if we drop our support, then they're going to be killed, right? And similarly, I think on the other side, there's a lot of fear, right, that this enormous army is killing a lot of people that either people know and love or feel in solidarity with. And if they don't maintain their strong support, then they're going to be killed even more. The folks on either side feel like if they let off the gas for even a second, a lot of people are going to be killed. And that's a lot of stakes. And I'm wondering what the response to that could be, because what I am perceiving is that the result of this extreme polarization is that each side becomes the thing that the other side most fears. Perhaps those of us who are on a side are actually much more likely to impact our side and the way that it's conducting itself, rather than our likelihood of impacting the other side.
One of the tasks that I've taken on myself with Shlemut is to ask the question, how can I help expand the spiritual capacity of American Jews to see what's happening in Israel-Palestine with eyes open? And one of the sub-questions that comes with that in thinking about supporting the American Jewish community to do that is to ask the question, when an oppressed group becomes oppressors, how do we hold them accountable? Part of what I think we see in the divide in the American Jewish community is that either the Israelis are the good guys or the Israelis are the bad guys. And there's a deep temptation in human existence to want to be the good guys and to want to know who the bad guys are. One of the reasons that Israel-Palestine has been such an engaging and compelling life work for me is because it turns out that we are good guys and bad guys. That just as we can point to Albert Einstein, he was Jewish. There are all of these Jews who do things that we can be so proud of. There are also Jews who are doing things that we're not proud of at all, but that is integral to the human experience. And so the divide around, are we Zionists, are we anti-Zionists, I think there's a little bit of a trap in a false binary here, because there are Israelis, there are Jewish Israelis who live in this place and are going to continue to live in this place. There are Palestinians, Palestinian citizens of Israel, Palestinians who are stateless in the West Bank and Gaza, who are going to continue to live there. So the question is, how do we transcend I'm good or bad, or also I think in some ways a false binary of Zionism or anti-Zionism, and ask, how is everyone going to live in this place in a meaningful and safe way?
I want to take us to our listeners, honestly, to American Jews considering this topic, Israel-Palestine, wandering through this unit with us, trying to find their place in this conversation, because I think that's what a lot of people are doing, right? And it mobilizes itself in productive, wonderful ways and also in toxic, terrible ways. Like, we've talked about this in other episodes, but like the impulse people have to be helpful, to be part of, improving discourse is what actually leads folks to like intervene and do all sorts of things on college campuses that we might think are causing more harm than good, right? Like they're trying to stand up for students that they believe are under siege, are being faced with unbelievable amounts of anti-Semitism. And so the impulse of let's do all sorts of Israel advocacy work, let's provide money, that's coming from a place of trying to help. And one thing we've been trying to do in this unit is say, okay, the impulse of how do I mobilize myself towards productive, towards good, towards peace, towards wholeness, that's a good impulse. But the ways that people are being, instruction manualed on that are not quite working. And so I'm actually curious to go to you, Danya. You have, and maybe me too, maybe I'm asking this question kind of selfishly, like we're both folks who work in Jewish life and are committed to questions of justice. But what we don't share with Ilana is that we haven't had as like the core of our work, as like an organization we found, as something like that, Israel-Palestine justice. We've both been adjacent to it and involved with it ourselves in many ways. But I'm curious how you go about navigating when you step in, when you don't, when you're called to action, when you're doing other things. Like we don't want to talk about that, right? Because it never is a good thing to say publicly, like, you know what, I'm prioritizing a different thing from this global important, I don't even want to say issue, like something that is taking human lives on a day-to-day basis. Like it's never good to be like, well, I'm putting that aside for a few days or weeks and doing something else. Like it is a question that a lot of people wrestle with. Like, how do we mobilize ourselves and how don't we? And I want to ask it in your wheelhouse through the prism of teshuvah, of repair, of repentance, because for so many of us American Jews, if we are going to wade into the waters of Israel-Palestine at all towards peace work, the starting point is often, oh my gosh, my community, or even me personally, has gone astray. And like, I know that's for me personally. Like when I started getting involved with this issue, some of the first steps, like the actual Yom Kippur thoughts in my head for a couple years in college were like, I've been part of forces through institutions I've been connected to, through even activism I had done growing up in high school as part of the like rah-rah Israel stuff. Like I had to start and do some inward introspection and then go from there. And I think that's a huge hurdle. Like you have to actually wrestle with your own culpability is like a scary word. And I don't want to sound like I'm saying everyone's like full of blame, but like you have to wrestle with the ways you've been implicated in some things and then channel yourself in ways that you find productive. And so how do we go about that? How does teshuvah play into this conversation? And how, for those of us who aren't able to commit our full lives to this topic, how do we still play a productive, meaningful role?
So, number one, I think the tshuva question, the repentance and repair, is important. Naming and articulating harm, because it is, once there is an understanding Once one is able to get out of denial about what is actually being done in Gaza and the West Bank by the state, by people who are given basically free rein by the state, there is that moment of the veil being lifted, but it's not a one-time thing. My veil began to be lifted the summer of 2000, and it's an ongoing lifting. There's a deep, I'm still 25 years later understanding more, going deeper in my understanding of the horrors. And it has to be a conscious choice every single time to go and learn and see. And then you're holding it and you have to do something with it. I've done a tshuva ritual with Professor Shira Schwartz that's been really powerful. I know Ilana has done a tshuva ritual on Zoom, extraordinarily powerful. As I read Maimonides, there are 5 steps to the work of tshuva, of repentance and repair. Step 1 is confession, is owning, naming the harm caused. And for so many of us, the articulation of first naming all that impulse towards denial, naming the ways that one has been complicit in harm, just articulating it and getting it out, naming it out loud, typing it into a chat box on a Zoom, writing it down on Post-its, whatever the thing is, having us a ritualized space to articulate some of the ways that you have been part of the harm of Palestinian people as an American Jew. It's freeing and necessary, because sitting with the guilt is a block from action for many people. And when you're able to acknowledge the ways in which you are part of larger systems, then you're able to own your agency to become part of the solution. As Rabbi Nachman famously says, if you acknowledge that you can harm, then you can acknowledge that you can heal, right? And so a ritual is a space to bring that together. Y'all can do this at home, right? You don't have to do this in a space that is collected. If you just make the space to start to write down, what is it that you want to own? What are the ways that you are part of this larger collective harm? And then step 2 of tshuva is start to change. What's one thing that you want to be or do differently around Israel-Palestine? Write it down. And then bring that intention into the world, seed it, right? And then 3 is amends. What would you do to start to put a stitch into the great gaping wound? You cannot fix everything, but what's some healing that you could put towards this? Then apology, and then making different choices.
But there's kind of a maturity about tshuva. I love this frame of tshuva because I think it allows us to do a lot of stuff. And the question for me is, like, step 1 is the tshuva of realizing, like you were saying, Lex, that you're sort of implicated in this larger story because you've been part of this Jewish story, the way that the Jewish story has been told, and you find that there are ways in which that has turned the oppressed into an oppressor, and you say, okay, I don't want to be part of that story. I want to do tshuva from that story. But I feel like there's a second step. And I always feel like it's really important when we're talking about tshuva. Like, a lot of people talk about tshuva that somebody else should do tshuva, or somebody, or say that, yeah, I'm part of this larger system, but it's been led by other people. And so I'm doing tshuva by removing myself from the system. But I actually think that there is a really important stage of asking, what do I myself personally have to do tshuva over? And that might happen after you've done the tshuva for the societal thing, right? And Ilana, I guess I feel like the style, the approach that you're articulating represents this, and I would like to dig into it more. Like, what is the way to, having done the national tshuva, or the tshuva that relates to the national, scale problems, how one makes sure that one goes forward in engaging in trying to make amends and make repair without creating new actions that are going to demand tshuva down the road?
It was thanks to Danya's book on repentance and repair that I realized the largest act of collective tshuva that the Jewish people need to make is an apology to Palestinians as a starting point. In August 2023, I led a pilot trip to Israel, to Jerusalem and the occupied West Bank, to meet with Palestinian colleagues to talk to them about a program that I was starting called Elul in Palestine. Elul is the Hebrew month that precedes the Jewish high holidays of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, when we engage in this period of introspection of where have I caused harm and how do I right that harm. And the way that I started about this program of Elul in Palestine was to go meet with Palestinian partners. I met with a dozen Palestinian colleagues in Israel, in Jerusalem, in the West Bank, to ask them, would it be meaningful to them and how would it be meaningful to them to hear and participate in some form of tshuva work that was done by Jewish leaders? Because the plan in August 2023 was to bring a delegation of rabbis into the West Bank to do exactly the kind of rituals that Danya has described around doing the introspective work to say, where have I done wrong? And then also engaging with the people who have been wronged and ask them what kind of repair they need. And every single Palestinian I met with said, would absolutely welcome the initiation of a repentance project. It seemed obvious to them because they know how harmed they've been by the actions of a state claiming to act in the name of Jewish values. This past Elul, when it was marking almost the 1-year yahrzeit memorial of October 7th, I designed a tshuva ritual that could be done on Zoom because traveling to the region wasn't realistic, feasible at the time. And I think it's important to clarify that in the act of engaging in tshuva, we can't and should not hold all Jews responsible for the actions of the state of Israel, because politically, that's anti-Semitism. And when I go to the synagogue to pray on Yom Kippur, the al chet, the I have sinned, the ways that I have hit the mark, are not actually the ways that I have hit the mark. They are the ways that we have hit the mark. All of these prayers that we say on Yom Kippur, on Rosh Hashanah, that talk about the ways we have wronged are in the collective. What we can do is we can disaggregate political responsibility from spiritual responsibility. And I think it's critical that as Jews, we take spiritual responsibility for what has been done in the name of Jewish people, whether we like it or not. This is the reality that we're living in. We're living in a reality in which a state claiming to protect all Jews has massacred close to 50,000 people, and tragically, the numbers will probably rise, has displaced millions of people who are living in tents. In order for me to take seriously my membership in Klal Yisrael as a person in the people of Israel, I take a degree of spiritual responsibility for what has been done in the name of Judaism. And part of what I think we need to do is shift the culture and consciousness towards saying to Palestinians, I'm sorry.
Yeah. I think that's really, really key. And it's amazing how in so many high level or medium level conversations about where do we go from here, things like say sorry don't get said. I mean, I frequently, on a very, mostly separate issue, people always or regularly ask me, like, Lex, you're in an interfaith relationship. The Jewish community has done harm to people in interfaith relationships. Like, what might we do to get more of them to join our synagogue? And I always start, like, write an op-ed in the local newspaper that says, for decades, our community has made interfaith families a key villain in the story of Judaism. We have been part of that. We regret that. And we are committed to learning how we can undo that and doing better moving forward. Write that op-ed. I have not seen that op-ed yet anywhere. On this issue, especially on Israel-Palestine, I do think that it would be really beautiful and basic, honestly, to start with that we have gone wrong.
Spectano.
For a people that prides itself on regularly saying, we have erred, we have gone wrong, literally liturgizing it, I don't know what the word, like making it into liturgy, we should do that. I want to sit with another little thing that, Ilana, you've done a couple times. You said, I want to take a step back, at least twice in this conversation. And I'm thinking of the moment in prayer where before the central moment, before the Amidah, where it's sort of seen as the centerpiece of the flow of our liturgy, it's in every service, you step back 3 times. It's one of my favorite moments of all of Jewish tradition, of like the whole everything. Part of it because I like sports, and there's a lot of sports where you have like 3-step walk-ups. If you watch field goal kickers in football, they always take like 3 steps back before, and then they take their 3 steps forward. Bowling has a 3-step or a 5. Like, I think there's actually something deep and embodied and true about how if we're going to channel ourselves into an action effectively, like our literal bodies, we have to step back. You were using it metaphorically, but taking a step back does feel like a key pivotal practice. And I say practice, another, like, I don't mean that just as like spiritual practice, like a thing to practice in our daily life that can help us do better. That's what practice is for, right? So taking a step back, we really need to value and cherish the piece of I don't know, movement ecology, the piece of what you were talking about. There's different arms of movements and different, like, taking a step back, I feel like we need to cherish and honor inspiration. We need to cherish and honor not just practical decision-making and strategy, but pieces of profound inspiration that move us. And so we talked about civil rights before. It wasn't just MLK. It wasn't just Martin Luther King. And Martin Luther King channeled an I Have a Dream speech that made a huge impact. Martin Luther King channeled a letter from a Birmingham jail that had a huge impact and that I think inspired people to act. The reverent piece of who he was. The fact that he spoke from this place of ministry, of spirituality, of inspiration was important. And so I'm wondering, in addition to dialogue and listening better, in addition to policy making, how do we inspire one another? You have a section of your website, Ilana, that says inspiration at the top. That's where this question came from. How do we inspire towards a better world and not just strategize toward one?
The first time I went to Bethlehem, I met Sami Awad. He is a leading light in the Palestinian nonviolent movement. And before that, that was in May of 2006, almost 20 years ago, I didn't know that you could say the word Palestinian and nonviolent in a sentence together because I had been raised with such a strong indoctrination that Palestinians were violent. I have had the extraordinary privilege of meeting Palestinian after Palestinian after Palestinian who, despite having their home demolished, despite having their olive trees uprooted, despite having their children, God forbid, arrested in the middle of the night, have said, I refuse to be enemies. It's because of the Palestinians who I have met and who have had the patience to work with me and to work with hundreds, if not thousands, of other Jewish activists who have come on the ground with Center for Jewish Nonviolence to say, I'm here to honor your dignity. I'm here to stand shoulder to shoulder with you. I recognize that you are living under inhumane circumstances and have chosen paths of resistance and existence that have not involved violence. They exist in the form of every single Palestinian who lives in the West Bank and has lived under inhumane circumstances, who lives in Gaza, because the vast majority of Palestinians are living nonviolently. Of course, we just witnessed a horrific act of violence. It's not to say that every single Palestinian is nonviolent, and certainly in the Israeli state, it's certainly not a nonviolent state either. But the inspiration of Sami Awad, of Issa Amro, of Layla Sansor, of Sam Bahor, of the Handel family, there are Palestinians after Palestinians who have opened their homes, who have walked the walk. And when I see the eyes of a young girl in Gaza, even if I don't know her name, I see in her all of the other Palestinians who I've met and worked with. And I wish that the American Jewish community, when they looked in the newspaper and when they saw the news, they could attach a real face and a real name, because every single one of those people has a real face and a real name. and they're doing extraordinary things to survive. That's where I get a lot of my inspiration from.
I'm trying to listen to our conversation through the ears of somebody who's not in agreement. And all the things that we've been saying over this period, on the other hand, we saw October 7th, right? On the other hand, we, thank God, have been seeing the hostages released over the weeks that we're recording these in, many of the hostages. And yet we know that there are hostages. These are civilian hostages. There shouldn't have been hostages. There shouldn't have been over 1,000 people killed on October 7th. So how can we have this conversation about amends and about tshuva without talking about the meaning of those things? I mean, I think that that's the part that I think it's really important for us to name and to talk about it very explicitly, because otherwise I think we're not going to persuade anybody in this conversation who is not already persuaded. And so I'm wondering how you think about, first of all, how you make meaning out of that event in particular, October 7th, and also a long history of violence from Palestinians, whether the Palestinians or some Palestinians are certainly driven by movements that have won elections in the Palestinian areas. And that's a serious point that I think we have to be able to speak to. And I don't quite know how to speak to that point. I'm curious what you have to say.
I want all Israelis to be safe, and I want all Palestinians to be safe. And it's indisputably clear to me that violence begets violence. And I'm absolutely never going to excuse or apologize for any violence, not violence that happens by Palestinians and not violence that happens by Israelis. And so without excusing or engaging in apologetics, I think what we can do is ask, how can we understand the violence that's happened? When I look at the violence that happened on October 7th, the horrific violence that happened on October 7th, I go to an association with the violence that happened in 1948, when Israeli forces murdered en masse Palestinians who were innocent living in their villages and depopulated hundreds of Palestinian villages in order to create the formation of Israel. I won't defend that violence. I think that it's indefensible. And I can understand where the Jews were coming from, because my own ancestors came from the European continent, where they had no choice but to leave, the ones who weren't slaughtered. And I know that the violence from 1948 that was perpetrated en masse by Jewish Israeli forces against Palestinians was never healed. The harm and the hurt that came from the creation of the State of Israel was never healed. And 75 years later, we saw a kind of horrific violence perpetrated by Palestinians, most of whom were the descendants of people who had either been killed or forced to be refugees in 1948, living in Gaza, attacking Israelis. And so for those who don't agree or don't yet agree or don't think that they agree with these kinds of peace-oriented proposals, I think we have to ask a really honest question. Is more violence going to create the kind of peace and security that we want? At what point do we say it's enough? We all have to say stop. There's a refrain in peacemaking that in both sides, everyone thinks that their violence is defensive and the other person's violence is offensive. But when you've killed 50,000 people and flattened an area of land that is double the size of Washington, D.C., I cannot see how the mass murder of thousands of innocent people, including at this point, the count is at nearly 18,000 children, makes anyone safer, because we know that violence begets violence.
I'm very sensitive to what you're talking about in terms of the cycle of violence. And I think that there's some desire, again, by both sides to kind of peg the beginning of the cycle of violence at an action by one or the other party. Maybe that's fruitful. I guess I'm asking if you think that that's fruitful. Because if so, then I guess we can hunt down the precipitating factor, and that will be the party that is sort of, quote, most at fault. But it strikes me that that's not generally how peacemaking moves ahead. Again, another reason why I feel like the Zionism versus anti-Zionism framing that has been widely accepted is just not helpful, because Zionism and anti-Zionism tend to linguistically go back to the founding of the state of Israel and ask, was that just a big mistake? And that gets a lot of people defensive. And the reason I think that this is important for our discourse on the U.S. Jewish way of dealing with all this is that I think that the reason why a lot of people who might, like me, think that the response that Israel had to October 7th was far too much is that they are afraid that by saying so publicly, they are kind of failing to make their co-religionists or, fellow Jews safe in Israel, and they don't want to accidentally do that. And so they're just being very cautious. What I'm trying to figure out is how we can talk about a peaceful future without having to make one side or the other more to blame. Because I think that a lot of people are just, have a tendency to say, if I hear one side's point of view being kind of elevated, then that is a essentially dismissal of the other side. And that's the great fear. I remember saying when, in the earlier days after October 7th, when there was a claim that Israel was forcing civilians to move out of certain parts of Gaza, so that they could bomb it and so that they could, kill Hamas people or whatever. People are like, oh, how kind. They're trying to make sure that the civilians won't be killed. And I was like, one thing that you have to understand is that it's core to the Palestinian trauma that they were displaced. And so you're actually doing the thing that they're most afraid of. So I kind of feel like I am really just trying to ask whether there's a way to have this discussion in a way that wouldn't make Jews so scared that they actually go to the other side.
I definitely think that back and forth conversation of which precise event started what thing in what way exactly how is not what will lead us to a political solution. We all do need to learn our history and we all need to really develop a deep power analysis. We can hold the both and. We can hold the simultaneity of the fact that Jews were horrifically oppressed in Europe and had nowhere to go, and that Jews showing up en masse to the land of Israel, even before 1948, began to displace Arab communities, right? We can name that. We can name that there have been Jews in the land of Israel, right? That not everybody was even kicked out after Bar Kokhba, and that there have always been Jews in that region. And we can name that the vast majority of the Jews who came with the founding of the land of Israel came at the end of the mid and end of the 19th century and later, right? We can name both of those things, right? That we are both victims and harm doers. We can look compassionately at the people who have been impacted, and we can acknowledge that at times in places along the history of the last couple of hundred years, Jews in the land of Israel have been harmed. And there's the collective trauma that has happened as a result of that. There's all of the both and there are 14 million people in the region now. Everybody, every single one of them deserves to be safe, deserves to be free, deserves full human and civil rights, and not all of them have it equally. The way power is distributed now is not equal. That's the piece that a lot of American Jews want to gloss over. Go visit a refugee camp. Go find out how Palestinians have been living for the last many decades. Go to understand what life is like at a checkpoint. It's not equal. Maybe not having to play the who hit who with the shovel first historically while learning our history deeply, but also saying today, right now, Everybody deserves to live safely and free and have access to food and water and education and health care, and not everybody does.
I think that if we study our history, particularly as Ashkenazi Jews looking at European history, what I find as the culprit is intolerance, discrimination, and inequality that pushed Jews out of Europe, out of Russia. Jews who arrived and settled in British Mandate Palestine, unfortunately, then propagated intolerance, discrimination, and inequality towards Palestinians. Jews living in America who have fought very hard for equality, diversity, and humanity, which isn't to say that there's not anti-Semitism in America, because there is, but there is not the kind of violence on the scale that we witness in Israel-Palestine. And so we do ourselves a favor by going deeper to seeing who the real culprits are, or what the real culprits are, and what the antidotes are to those culprits. And so if the culprits are intolerance, discrimination, and inequality, and the antidotes to those are shared humanity, diversity, and equality, then we have our guiding set of North Stars for us in Israel-Palestine.
So, as a closing question, this is Ilana focused and it's time focused, because I happen to know some inside knowledge, which is that you are, in not too long, going to be a rabbi. And thus far in your Israel-Palestine work, you have not been a rabbi. And so you are uniquely situated to give us some wisdom on a question I spend a lot of time thinking about. I'm really curious how you would articulate what the roles are of rabbis in particular in this conversation and what aren't. Because I think we're confusing that, and like the role for, this is my thought, the role of rabbi is not the same as the role of like holder of deep scholarly historic knowledge or political science knowledge. And sometimes people look to their rabbis for that. And they're going to do that to some degree. So like, how might we think about the roles of rabbis? And for those listening who are mostly not rabbis, the roles of those outside of the rabbinate?
There's a text study that I love in the Talmud that speaks to this, in which Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva are having a classic Talmudic debate. And they're asked, is study greater or is action greater? And Rabbi Tarfon says, action is greater. And Rabbi Akiva answers and says, study is greater. And so everyone agrees with Rabbi Akiva and says study is greater. But that's not where the story ends. There's another line. It says, study is greater because it leads to action. Rabbis can do a really great job in teaching, in praying, in helping to shape the minds and hearts of the Jewish people. And I would love to see rabbis engage in much more teaching and prayer around the sacred mythological and the ancient historical and the contemporary dynamics of Eretz Yisrael, the biblical land of Israel, of Am Yisrael, the people Israel, and Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel. And when it comes to action, I would love to see rabbis encouraging their students who have learned with them to then go forth and take the actions that are most aligned with the divine guidance, the guidance from the universe that they're receiving around how to be agents of peace and justice for Israel-Palestine.
Thank you both so much for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. We especially hope that you'll continue on with us in this unit of episodes exploring American Jewish discourse about Israel-Palestine. We've been so grateful for the feedback we've received so far, and you can keep it coming via email, social media, all the things I'll say in just a second. Before I do, a reminder that we have courses in the Yeshiva that are currently open for registration. There are 5 of them. One, Judaism Inbound, is our 12-week first step introduction to Judaism class for those who are looking to convert or those who just want a class about the basics of Jewish practice. And there are 4 other classes that are a little shorter, 8-week classes, and you can register for all of those at judaismunbound.com/classes. Financial aid is available for any and all of them. We hope that you will head to our website and learn more. As we close, we do want to encourage you to be in touch with us, as mentioned previously, and we hope that you'll do so via any of the following platforms. There's our Facebook and Instagram handles. Both of those are at Judaism Unbound. There's our website, JudaismUnbound.com, where you can find show notes for this episode, where you can learn more about our work, all sorts of goodies. And there are our email addresses, dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. So once again, we're so grateful for you listening to this episode and to whichever others in this unit you have so far. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.